All right, we're going to get started. So happy World Mental Health Day. My name is Farah, and I'm a therapist that works at the Lighthouse, who specializes in working with grief, trauma, depression, anxiety. And I also serve as the director of our mental health first aid program. And we're speaking about stigma today and what it means to actually end stigma. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And what we're going to speak about today is what is stigma and what is the impact of stigma? What are the action steps that you can take both personally and professionally to combat it or end it within yourself, on your teams, in your workplaces? What does it mean to actually have a supportive, compassionate mindset when it comes to mental health? And what can you do to stop it? And how do you respond with empathy when you're speaking about mental health or to someone who's struggling with their mental health? And lastly, what are those action steps you can take to take care of your own mental health better, which is a really important aspect of ending stigma, is beginning to acknowledge deeply your inner world and taking care of that. Okay, so I invite all of you to do a thought exercise with me. And I see many people raising their hand. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. And then at the end of today's session, I will take some questions and answers. So I ask you to hold your questions until then. So I want you to imagine that you have a week where you're feeling quite depleted, overwhelmed, exhausted, full of dread. Maybe you struggle to sleep that night and you wake up in the morning. You call your manager or you call your boss. Do you say that you have an upset brain, or do you opt for saying that you have an upset stomach? Most of us would be quite reluctant to say, I'm full of dread, or I'm struggling to function today, so I'm going to take a day off. That is one of those concrete effects of stigma that affects your life right now. That when you're not feeling well, perhaps emotionally or in your thoughts, or due to stress, that we are very reluctant to share with an employer or even with a friend to say, I don't feel like, I'm just not feeling that great in my emotional health, which is why I don't feel like going out. That is how stigma impacts you. And it does impact each and every one of us. I want to take a closer look at some myths, some common myths around mental health that fuel stigma. So the myth that you don't know anyone that is struggling with their mental health, that's false. I can confidently say that you do know someone, because we know that 1 in 4 people struggle with their mental health. So that means a quarter of the people on today's call, a quarter of your team members, a quarter of the people in your family and extended family are struggling with their mental health right now. We also know that that 1 in 4 number was pre-pandemic, and it comes from English-speaking countries where people have eventually went to the doctor. We know that most people will never go and get diagnosed or reach out for professional support, and the stigma in the region is even higher. So you do know someone, I promise you. You probably know many people. And the fact that many of us do not know who those individuals are, and that those team members, those friends, those family members are so reluctant to say, I'm actually not okay, is another indicator of how stigma silences people, right? Another myth is that mental health problems are untreatable. They are treatable. Many people may have an episode of depression or an anxiety disorder and bounce back to their life. Others may have more chronic illness, which can happen as well, but it is still very manageable, where you can even live with things like an anxiety disorder or depression and actually have great mental health too. Okay. Another myth is that if you are struggling with how you're feeling or your mental health, that is a sign of weakness. And we know that very rarely does illness present as in the tearful, Eeyore, crying, not functioning person, especially in the region. Oftentimes, people who are struggling are in leadership positions, are very bubbly and funny, engaged, and quite high performing, that the nature of our mental health is very invisible. So I know for me, when I was younger, one of the biggest things that almost gave me permission to talk about mental health was hearing other people's stories. So I remember learning about Martin Luther King, who's a famous American civil rights leader who had 2 suicide attempts as a teenager and struggled with depression throughout his life. I learned about Michelle Obama talking about depression, or Michael Phelps. There's been so many recent Olympic athletes speaking about their struggle with anxiety and depression. And even in our lives, I know for me, when I've had leaders who I respect talk about their struggle, right? It's typically not the person that you think, oh, they're weak or they're not functioning in their life. That is a huge myth. So even Olympic athletes, right, who have great physical health are not 100% immune to developing mental health, to developing physical health problems. And the same is true with mental health, that you can actually have good mental health, but you're not no one is 1,000% immune to developing mental illnesses. It can impact all of us. And another myth is that you only need to take care of your mental health if you have a problem. And that's just not true. And it's the same as physical health, right? Even if you don't have a physical disease, there are still things you must do to take care of your physical health. And the same is true with emotional health. And we are going to speak about what are those essential things you must do to take care of your own emotional health, whether you're struggling or not. Right? Another myth is that if you ignore emotional pain, that will go away. And that's just not true. The longer we ignore emotional pain, it's like storing or accumulating debt on a credit card. It doesn't go away and it stays within our body, right? Because emotions are meant to be processed and released. And if you actually look at fMRI, these brain scans, when we look at what's happening in the body with physical pain and emotional pain, the same centers of the brain light up for both types of pain. And we know that mental illnesses or like depression or anxiety disorders can be just as disabling as many physical health conditions. So there was a really powerful study WHO did about almost a decade ago, and they were looking to measure how disabling can it be to live with certain mental health conditions, specifically depression. And what they found was that living with moderate depression is as disabling as living with severe asthma, and living with severe depression is as disabling as living with disseminated breast cancer. And by disseminated, we mean the cancer has advanced to other parts of your body. So it's not that mental health conditions are less serious than physical health illnesses. They can be just as disabling and painful as physical illnesses. And another myth is that people with mental illnesses are dangerous and violent. Right? We know that less than 1% of violence is due to mental health problems. It's actually significantly more connected to substance abuse, right? So what is stigma? The root of the word stigma is there's like Latin and Greek origins. And what it means is to tattoo, a mark, a stain of disgrace. Right. And it was interesting as I was researching stigma more deeply in the last few weeks, there's a story in many of the Abrahamic religions of the sons of Adam and Eve, right? So there's Cain and Abel. And what they found was that the first language and story around stigma was when Cain, the elder brother, murdered his younger brother Abel. And then it was said that he was given a mark or a tattoo, which meant that the world would know that he murdered his brother. And it was a sign of being ostracized and disgraced, right? That's what we mean by stigma. It's a feeling of being defective, ostracized, like something is deeply wrong with this person, right? We know that mental illnesses are the #1 ranked stigmatized illness of all physical illnesses. 1 in 2 people say they are frightened by someone who's struggling with their mental health, and 4 in 5 say that it's harder to admit or seek support for a mental illness than any other illness. So let's take a closer look at what the effects of this are. We know that the average onset of a depressive episode or an episode of anxiety that's interrupting someone's life will begin by the age of 14. It will then go untreated for 10 years. 10 years, right? So imagine for 10 years thinking, if only I were better, stronger, faster, more handsome, more beautiful, that, more talented, then maybe I wouldn't feel this way, right? Imagine how struggling for 10 years with an illness will impact where you go to university, your self-esteem, your self-worth, your relationships, right? It's quite terrifying, actually. And we know that, and this was a recent study done in the US by the CDC, and they found that the average adult will wait 7 years before they ever receive, after 7 years before they receive support for depression, which is quite alarming, okay? And there was, these last 3 bullet points was a survey done in the UK and Wales. And what they found was that 1 in 3 people on teams are afraid they will be retaliated against, judged, or fired if they sought support for mental health. 1 in 10 people consider the main reason for mental health problems to be a lack of discipline or willpower. Okay, and this is in the UK. We know that the stigma is even more powerful here. And these are reactions that resonate with us. I know this, where we'll say, ooh, will this be used against me in my review? Or, I don't want my manager to know that I'm seeking support. Or you'll hear people say judgmental things like, you just need to be more positive. You just need to, do this better. And I'll just go at it on my own. And I just need to tough it out, right? And we know that 1 in 12 people believe that a woman would be foolish to marry someone who is struggling with their mental health, despite recovery rates being very good when you receive support, right? Now, other harmful effects we know will be that 2 in 3 people will never seek help, right? Or they will heavily delay seeking treatment, okay? So they're just never going to go to the doctors. And if they do, they will only come when the results are catastrophic, when they're struggling to function, or we're seeing crises. And we're saying, yes, mental health professionals, we're there if there's crises, but we want, the dream is that people will come in sooner than later, because then recovery times will not be as long. When treatment is delayed, that will mean more appointments, that may be more costly. You may need time off from work, and it can have a wider impact. And we know that shame is the most lethal emotion, right? And the definition of shame is feeling or believing that you are unworthy of love or belonging. So whatever that thing in your life is, you're like, I don't want anyone to know, that top secret vault, putting it on, I don't want you to know this about me. Usually those experiences or feelings carry shame, right? And we know that mental health or mental health struggles carry so much shame, and they fuel depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and even addictive symptoms, right? It's that feeling of unworthiness. So the larger effect of stigma, it makes people who are struggling worse. It's like an injury upon an injury, right? There can be isolation, right? That I don't want you to know what I'm really going through. Maybe you won't see me the same. Maybe you won't like me, which can create a lot of disconnect, even in close relationships. There may be bullying or discrimination that you face, and a lot of lost opportunities. When someone's struggling and carrying a lot of pain, perhaps I'm not taking up an activity or going for that promotion or traveling to that place or growing my relationship in some ways. There's a lot of loss that the pain causes. And the longer illness goes untreated, the more at risk an individual is to go on to experience a crisis. So we may see untreated depression or anxiety morph into then having suicidal thoughts or behaviors or panic attacks. And we really don't want to get to that state, right? Where people are experiencing a lot of pain. We're here to support if that happens, but this is another impact of stigma. It's like, I'll hear people say, well, it's not that bad, right? Well, I'll just go at it and we don't want to wait till it gets really bad, and we don't want to risk that, right? Because the longer we ignore emotional pain, the worse it may become. And of course, another impact of stigma is when someone is struggling, there's a lack of empathy and understanding from the people around us, which can fuel isolation and make what you're struggling with quite worse. So there's a lot of harmful impacts. And I love this image of this guy. He's like putting it under the rug, and eventually the rug gets all lumpy and you may trip over it. Okay. So there's different types of stigma. And when you think of stigma and the attitudes and thoughts, think of like you're wearing a lens, right? Which prevents you from accurately seeing the other person with empathy and considering what they may actually need. So larger public stigma is made up of stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination, right? So there's many things in the media, movies, shows, news that we see that fuels stigma. So the most recent movie I think of is The Joker with Joaquin Phoenix. Although I love the, Superman world and Marvel and all of that. But that movie really fueled a lot of stigma when it comes to mental health, right? There was a really clear link between mental illness and violence. Things like this fuel misinformation collectively. And when we look at stereotypes, it's going to be a negatively held belief. So it may be people with mental health problems are weak or dangerous, or maybe they're just lazy or lack self-discipline. That's a stereotype. It's a lens or in which you see people who struggle, and it leads to prejudice. And when you think of prejudice, think of a emotional response. It will be, they scare me or they frustrate me. And that can lead to a discriminatory attitude where it's actions you may take that make things worse for others. It may be not hiring people who are struggling. It may be ostracizing them. There may be a judgmental response that you have, right? And that creates collective stigma. All of that stigma in our environment leads to something called internalized stigma, right? So when that's happening all around us, then when we're struggling, we're like, maybe something is wrong with me. Maybe I just do need to be more positive. And there can be a lot of fear and shame around being honest and open or reaching out for support. Okay. So I want you to know, and many of you may have heard, me talk about this, that our mental health lives on a continuum, right? So this vertical line that you're seeing should look familiar if you've attended the Your Mind Matters talk, right? And I want you to know, just like our physical health, our mental health lives on a continuum. Some days are really good, we're feeling optimistic, connected to people, and other days or weeks we can have poor mental health, right? We're feeling depleted or exhausted. What I want to highlight is this upper left quadrant, is that you can be living with a mental health condition like depression and have great mental health. So that means I'm managing my care, I'm going to counseling, I have great lifestyle choices, and I'm thriving, right? The same way you can be living with physical pain and be taking all the action steps that you need to manage that pain and be doing quite well. You can also be living with no mental illness and have very poor mental health, meaning you're not taking care of your emotional hygiene. You are harsh with yourself, critical. There may be inner neglect and even acknowledging feelings or pain that you're carrying. Now, usually when you're in that lower right quadrant where you're not, you're fine, you don't have anything diagnosed, but you're not taking care of yourself. Usually then a risk factor comes along, like a pandemic or a really stressful project that you're working on, and it will shift us into the most dangerous quadrant, which is that lower left area, where you are not caring for your inner world, and we're seeing an illness as well, right? So this lives on a continuum, right? So what I'd like to do together now is do a self-evaluation, right? So I want you to be thinking about, where do I stand in terms of my mindset and attitude towards mental health and mental health concerns, right? So we're going to take a look at this meter, and this meter can be any car or plane you want it to be. It can be a Ferrari or a Ford or a Mercedes or whatever you like, okay? So we'll take a closer look at what a discriminatory mindset is, a judgmental mindset, indifferent, sympathetic, empathic, or compassionate. So let's take a closer look at this. And I ask you to be brave and vulnerable with yourself, to be thinking about throughout your life and your career, where have you been on this meter, okay? So a discriminatory mindset is going to be that you actually make things worse for someone who's struggling. So imagine I come to you and I say, maybe your name is Johnson, I'm making that up. And I say, Johnson, I've sprained my ankle and I need to make sure there's a ramp for me when I come into the building. And Johnson says, I'm not building you a ramp. I'm actually going to add extra steps. Okay. He's actually made it worse for me to try and get into the building. And that's what we mean by a discriminatory mindset, where someone discloses that they're struggling with their mental health and no reasonable accommodation is made. You actually make things more challenging. I'm like, I'm going to make that meeting even earlier in the morning. Okay. So this can also mean ostracizing someone, not including them in opportunities. It can also mean bullying or making harsh comments towards the person, right? Now, a judgmental mindset is going to be holding negative thoughts and attitudes. So you will feel somewhat superior. I'm like, well, I never had to take time off when I was struggling, or, he should just suck it up or man up, or she should be tougher, or it's a judgmental mindset. And it feels like that's just them. That would never happen to me. And you may talk about that person or mental health concerns in a negative way. An indifferent mindset is going to be the belief that there's no place for this. You're like, we don't talk about this. Not our problem, not our concern. We don't talk about mental health in our family, in our community, in our school, or in our workplace, right? So it's like turning a blind eye. And a sympathetic response is how we do unintentional harm. And sympathy is superficial empathy. So think of the word superficial. It means it lacks depth, right? So I may say, Johnson, you're feeling really sad. And I hope no one's name is Johnson. I totally made him up. He's always my fake person. You may say, oh, Johnson, you feel sad? Oh, that's too bad. And notice my tone. It feels like pity. And no one likes receiving sympathy. It feels like disconnect, okay? So I kind of want to know, but I don't want to touch it. I don't want to get too close. And ideally, we're in a mindset and using the scale of empathy, where when we believe someone may be struggling or discloses a struggle with their mental health, we're curious. We're saying, what must this person be going through? What do they need? If I or my sister or my brother were going through that, how would I respond in that situation, right? It's being really curious about what they're experiencing and what their needs may be. Now, compassion is a value. It's a deeply held value, and it's empathy into action. It's saying the belief that you do have a responsibility to integrate and speak about mental health and say, what can I do to support someone who may be struggling? And how can I be curious about this and get them connected to the right support? Now, all of you taking an hour out of your lives to be here today and say, I want to know what I can do to end stigma. I want to know we care at our organization or in our family or school. You're already taking compassionate action, right? Now, this is not linear. So if you are hungry, angry, lonely, tired, depleted, you're more likely to go towards the left side of the meter, right? So we can shift on this. And this framework is here for you to be conscious of saying, where am I on this meter? And to consciously connect with, hopefully empathy and compassion, right? It's also really easy to be empathic with people we like. They sound like us. They remind us of someone that we like, right? And if it's someone that kind of irritates you, or you're like, oh, just, I don't like them, it's going to be harder to stay with empathy and compassion. So you will have to consciously dig deeper, right? So I want to pause there. And I want to ask you a different question, which is, in terms of your relationship with yourself, where are you on this meter when it comes to your mental health? So when you have weeks and months where you're feeling overwhelmed, hopeless, afraid, lonely, overwhelmed, Do you respond by making things worse for yourself? You're like, come on, we'll just sleep next year. And, we just need to be tough and keep going. Where you actually make things worse for yourself? Do you hold a judgmental attitude where the inner response is, what's wrong with me? At least I have a house, at least I have a good job. You shouldn't feel this way, just tough it out. Judgment. Or is there a mindset of indifference where you think, I don't even check in with myself. I don't have time for this, right? Like I just need to keep going. Or is there sympathy where you'll be like, oh yeah, it's tough, but whatever, like I just need to keep going, right? Where it lacks depth or space. Or is there an empathic response where you are curious and you say, okay, what's going on for me? What may I need? What's happening? What can I do to support myself? Right? That's really important. In terms of your relationship and you must also be in the space of empathy and compassion. And that is how we have great mental health, and it is protective. Okay, so what we're going to do next is I'm going to talk about, to deepen the meter and speak about what are 7 concrete action steps you can take between you and around you to end stigma against mental health. These are not the only 7 ways, but these are the 7 ways we believe are the most important, okay? And here's a summary, and then I'm going to deep dive into each one. And the first thing we're saying is do no harm. Don't make things worse for yourself or others. So even if you're not going to do any of the other action steps, which I hope you do, we're saying don't make things worse through judgmental, discriminatory attitudes or mindsets. And we'll take a deeper look at that. The second one is to make sure you're practicing empathy and vulnerability. If you identify that someone's struggling, I want you to sincerely check in with them using open-ended questions. Okay, I'm gonna build that skill for you. The third one will be mastering emotional hygiene, knowing the signs that someone may be struggling, making it your business to respond, to check in with a professional sooner than later, and I'll tell you what reasons may warrant that, to learn more about mental health and response skills, and lastly, to not go at it alone if there's a crisis for you or for someone in your life, right? So let's take a closer look at that first action step, is to not make things worse for someone. So when you're speaking about mental health, these are the things that make things worse for others, okay? So you don't want to say things like only weak people develop problems, mental health problems, or things like, well, I would never let it get to that point, or he or she is just doing that for attention, or I went through tough times, but I never complained. I never needed extra support or to take time off. Or you may say, well, it's not appropriate to speak about mental health in the workplace, right? And we do unintentional harm by not using person-first language. So saying things like, Johnson is a depressed person, right? So think of when we say, this person-first language actually comes from disability studies, right? Where we would say, we'd never say Johnson is disabled. We'd say Johnson is living with a disability. And the same is true with mental health. Johnson is struggling with anxiety, not he is a global anxious person. That's just one part of him, right? Or pity. Oh, I feel so bad for Johnson. Or toxic positivity. If only he were more positive or prayed more, then he wouldn't be struggling, right? That's how we do unintentional harm. Now, when you're speaking to someone who may be struggling, these are also things you do not want to say. Don't say things like, this wouldn't be happening if you were stronger, or it's all in your head. Stop being so negative. You're not fun. You're ungrateful. Stop being pathetic or feeling sorry for yourself, or you're being dramatic or sensitive, or you're faking it. And a lot of harmful toxic masculinity, things like man up, boys don't cry, not helpful. That's how we do harm. And we do unintentional harm by saying things like, be strong, or you just need to think about this differently, or look on the bright side, or at least you live in Dubai, or just get on with it. And a really common one in the region will be, if your faith were stronger, you wouldn't feel this way. Okay, don't say these things to others, and don't say them to yourself, right? Because when you say it to you too, you're also doing harm to your own emotional health. So we don't want to make things worse for people. Now, so action step number one is we do no harm. And the second action step to ending stigma, and I would really say empathy and knowledge are the antidote to mental health stigma. And so we want to practice empathy, and this is a skill, right? So if you're speaking to someone who's struggling, the tool you use is open-ended questions where you say, how have you been? You know, a closed-ended question is, are you okay? And you're like, yeah, I'm okay. Nothing's wrong, right? And you're like, nope, okay. And closed-ended questions are just conversation killers anyway, right? So open-ended, how have you been? Pause. What have things been like for you? How long have you been feeling this way? You said you're exhausted. How long has that been there, right? Would you be comfortable telling me more about, you know, what you mean by stressed? Or if they're like, oh, I just feel weird and, you know, blah. Well, what do you mean by blah? Okay. Is there anything we can do or I can do to support you this week? That's important because there's no one size fits all approach when it comes to mental health, right? Different team members, different family members will need different things. So be curious and then consider whether it's a reasonable request that you can honor. And encourage self-care. You may say, what have you been doing to take care of yourself? Pause. The use of silences is really important when it comes to empathy. And I have really learned throughout, you know, these last few years in doing trainings and sitting with clients and working with the community is that we as a society do not know how to listen anymore. As soon as someone tells us that we're feeling something difficult, we want to fix it, we want to solve it, we want to take it away. We do it to ourselves and we do it to others, and it's harmful for our mental health, right? So we want to listen and then offer hopeful, validating statements. So you may say, that sounds really tough to go through. I can't imagine what that's been like for you. Pause. I'm here to listen if you'd like to talk. Thank you for opening up to me about what you've been going through. Wow, I don't even know what to say, but I'm so glad you told me. You may say, we call this active constructive communication. You may say, what I'm hearing you say is that lately you've been feeling overwhelmed. Is that right? If anyone's been in couples therapy, you know this skill, right? It's mirroring back and clarifying. Is that, am I hearing that right? Okay. And you may offer supportive statements like, I think mental health is just as important as physical health. And if someone starts crying, let them cry. Don't tell them to stop. And say, please don't apologize for crying. Or you may just say, that's a lot to go through. Pause. This is what empathy feels and sounds like, right? And some prompts you can use. Now, when you're talking about mental health, you may say things like, we all have mental health, just like we have physical health. It's not something only crazy people have. Mental health is not the same thing as mental illness. You may say, in my fantasy, and what you'll take from this is you may say to someone, would you be open to seeing a counselor? And they're like, you know, no, I'm fine, I'll figure it out. And you may say, well, I respect that decision. But what I've learned is that the longer we ignore emotional pain, the more likely it is to worsen. Okay. And vulnerability in person first language. So you may say Johnson is experiencing depression or he's experiencing anxiety. And one of the most powerful ways to end stigma is vulnerability. So sharing your story. I know one of the most powerful experiences for me is when I learned that Martin Luther King struggled with depression and had 2 suicide attempts as a teenager. Mother Teresa struggled with severe depression. Even when leaders in my organization spoke about their struggle, I was like, okay, if these people that I really respect and admire can experience that, then maybe it's okay to also talk about my experience. And we know that when uncles, mothers, fathers, leaders say, yeah, I've been to counseling, or yeah, I was really scared for a month during these last 2 years, then others are also more likely to open up, ask for help, and connect. So sharing stories can be really, really important, okay? Now 3, so we've said do no harm, respond with empathy. Okay. And the third one is to take care of your own mental health. So let's get really clear and specific on what is emotional hygiene and how do you take care of yourself. All right. So First things first, if you're feeling depleted or you're just having a very high stress week or a month or maybe a stressful year, the first thing you want to do is not make things worse for yourself, right? So don't hang out with people who deplete. So you may not spend that evening with your mother-in-law, although I have a very lovely mother-in-law, but don't connect with people who feel like, oh, they're just like an energy vampire for me. Don't have clutter around you, right? That can create more of a stress response. Do not engage with the news, movies, or shows that are traumatic or overwhelming. It will make things worse for you. And you want to make sure that you are not shaming yourself or speaking to yourself disrespectfully, right? So for example, if I said, I'm feeling really exhausted this week, I'm like, okay. And if my inner response is, what's wrong with you? What do you have to feel exhausted about? Tough it up, keep going. That inner criticism makes the emotional pain or stress worse. It's equivalent to someone else saying it to you, right? So make sure you're responding with respect and compassion. And another way you do not want to do harm is when you're anxious, don't have caffeine. Caffeine is going to exacerbate anxiety. And if you're feeling low, do not have alcohol because the next day you're going to feel low and flat. Alcohol is a depressant. Okay, so first things first, don't make things worse for yourself. And then by essential self-care, we mean go to sleep for at least 7 hours, 7 hours straight. And sleep is the essential fuel for your vehicle. If you are not sleeping or unable to sleep, imagine there is a puncture in the gas tank, right? So whatever, all these other things we do, it's going to be like we're leaking fuel here. So make sure you're sleeping at least 7 hours. And if you're like, I'm trying and I can't, then check in with the counselor or a GP, okay? Make sure you're eating nutrient-dense meals, moving at least 5,000 steps, if not 10,000, and some practice of going inward. It can be mindfulness, meditation, journaling, prayer, talking to someone who makes a lot of space for you, right? The research behind this is endless to make space for you. Our frontal lobe looks outward. It's an expert at detecting threat. And we need to have a space where we actually look inward and say, how am I? What is my inner forecast, right? And you have to have fun, guys, right? So that means unstructured play, zoning out, doodling or playing with a child. We need fun and rest for our emotional and physical health, okay? Another pillar of emotional hygiene is giving yourself permission to feel, right? And most of us, including myself, have grown up in homes where we never talked about feelings. We never said the word mental health, right? So what does it mean to feel? It means I can identify my feelings, acknowledge them, and then soothe them. So for example, if I said, okay, and you can do this in 3 minutes as a start. You can say, okay, what am I feeling today? I'm like, okay, I'm feeling a bit sad. Okay, all right, I've identified the feeling. Okay, now I'm going to acknowledge it. Well, where do you feel sad in your body? In your heart, in your stomach? Is it in my neck? What color is it? If that sadness were a painting or a weather forecast, what would it look like? Is it a storm? Is it, is it foggy? What does it look like? That is you feeling the feeling. So once I've identified and acknowledged, then you search for soothing, not solutions. We don't solve feelings. We want to ventilate them, right? So I'll say, okay, I acknowledge I'm feeling sad. It looks kind of like a dark storm approaching, okay? Although I'm okay, guys, but just saying. And all right, what can I do in this hour or today that would be soothing, right? So I'll say, okay, I'm going to connect with certain people that kind of nourish me and energize me, or 5 sensory experiences. I may light candles or play music or sit in silence or take a bath. Now, the thing about self-care is I'm not saying, oh, you're feeling sad, go take a bath. That doesn't fix the feeling. It's saying I acknowledge my sadness and I'm searching for what comforts me, and what soothes me will not soothe you, right? So I don't imagine many of you are like, oh, I'm going to watch Oprah videos. Okay. So self-knowledge is important. What soothes you, what comforts you. Really important. So maybe connecting with nature or a passion project. This is what we mean by essential, non-negotiable emotional hygiene, right? And because of the stigma, even around the word emotions and mental health, we don't know how to do these things, right? Especially with toxic masculinity, right? Boys don't cry, don't feel your feelings, man up. And many people will come and say, I don't even know how to feel. And that's actually a risk factor for poor mental health. So, take a picture of this, you'll get a handout of this, make sure you're taking care of your own mental health. Now, so we've said first action step, do no harm. Second action step is empathy and open-ended questions. And the fourth one is saying, be curious about learning the signs that someone may be struggling. I'm not going to read all of them. I'm going to highlight some though. If you notice that someone is struggling, we want you to check in with empathy. So if you notice someone doesn't seem like themselves, they're withdrawing, they feel excessively worried, or they're no longer turning on their audio or video, not a one-off. Most times you're like noticing a little bit of a pattern. You may notice that they're not sleeping well, they're sending emails or messages really late at night, they seem forgetful, or they're quite cynical most days. They may be struggling with their mental health. Sometimes it's really hard to see the signs, right? Because our mental health is quite invisible. But if you notice someone is struggling, I want you to check in. So some of the signs, now don't diagnose yourself. This is primarily informational. But if there are signs of depression, you can see that feeling of emptiness, hollowness, that feeling of I'm just not enjoying things anymore. And with anxiety disorders, it can be that excessive worry or fear response that's there, feeling quite highly self-critical. You may see some of these signs in an individual, right? So if you're concerned about someone, I want you to ask yourself these questions. Are they going through anything important, big transitions in their life, relationship problems, a move, a marriage, a new child, certain stressors? Does it seem uncharacteristic of them or unlike them? Is it affecting their ability to work, their relationships, or their health? And has it been happening for more than 2 weeks? And these are some really important, if you're like, yes, 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 those are big red flags that the person may be struggling. And clinically we say more than 2 weeks, but we know most people will go 7 years before they get help for depression. So oftentimes it's a lot more than 2 weeks. Okay, so we're looking out for signs, and we're saying if we do see signs, we don't want to ignore them. We want to be curious and look beneath the tip of the iceberg and say this person may be struggling. Okay, so the fifth thing is we want to check in with professionals sooner than later. We don't want individuals to only wait until there's crisis to say, now I am worthy of going, now I should go. And it's actually a really common question we get is, why should I come in and what warrants coming in? So if you or someone in your life notices that you're having disrupted sleep or appetite, okay, big life transitions, promotions, job loss, moving countries, a loss, if you often find yourself feeling angry, irritable, empty, worried, panicked, or feeling inadequate a lot or insecure, like imposter syndrome, or you're like, I just feel kind of lost. These are all very valid things to come in and say, I'm just want to check in with the counselor. Like, I want to examine this a bit, right? If you find that you're no longer enjoying things you used to, or isolating yourself, if there's conflict in your relationships, or you're like, I just want more meaningful relationships. I want to live more of a purpose-driven life. That's also appropriate to check in sooner than later. If you're struggling to communicate with people, or you're feeling overwhelmed, or you're using a lot of substances or a certain behavior to cope, you want to come in and check in. And we're, of course, there to process childhood experiences. Or if you're like, I just want to build emotional intelligence. Like, I don't know how to feel my feelings. And we know that EQ is the biggest predictor of success in leadership positions as well. Or you've experienced a loss. These are all good experiences to check in sooner than later, right? We don't want to wait until there's crisis. Now, 6 is we're saying, let this be a starting point to learn more about mental health. So you may go on to take a first aid training. You get curious about your company and say, what resources do we have? Do we have an EAP program? Does our insurance cover psychology or psychiatry? Get really curious. Does your organization have sick leave for mental health as well? All right. So ideally, the dream is that there's parity when it comes to mental and physical health in policy and resources. And there's great books. I recently watched the Oprah documentary on Apple TV called The Me You Cannot See, which is a great resource as well, right? And 7 is we're saying don't go at it alone, especially if you or someone else is experiencing a crisis. So if there's suicidal thoughts or behavior, or, when you look at the slide, I want you to think of, how sometimes you go to WebMD, you're like, okay, what's going on here? And then there'll be a section that says, now you should go to the doctors. Like, you must go now, okay? So like, I remember when it said, if you press on your gallbladder and it hurts, you need to go to the doctor, right? That's what I want you to think of when you see this slide, where you're like, okay, this means emergency. If there's suicidal thoughts or behaviors, if you are having thoughts or someone discloses to you they're having thoughts of harming themselves or another, if you've experienced a panic attack, or you feel, these are a lot rarer, but a psychotic episode is kind of losing touch with reality, seeing or hearing things that are not there. They're much rarer, but that is a mental health crisis. If there's a struggle with addiction, or if someone is experiencing bullying, abuse, or harassment, right? We're saying, check in. Do not go at it alone. Get a first aider involved, get a professional involved, make sure this person or you are supported, okay? Resources that can be helpful would be GP, psychologists who provide talk counseling, psychiatrists are medical doctors, so they prescribe medication. Counselors and psychologists don't prescribe. And the word counselor is an umbrella word, right? So counselor can be clinical social worker, marriage and family therapist, master's in counseling therapy. It's an umbrella word, right? And other people who can help will be your HR, an employee assistance program. If you don't know if you have one, then please find out. Mental health first aid officers, if you have those trained in your organization, and some nonprofit organizations can also be helpful, okay? So in summary, what are we saying? Don't make things worse for others or for yourself. So do no harm. If you identify that someone's struggling, check in with empathy, use those open-ended questions, and be vulnerable, right? Especially if you're in a leadership position, to talk about struggles, to share stories. Take care of your own mental health, master that emotional hygiene. What you will do is role model to teams, to families, to communities that it's okay to talk about this. It's okay to talk about mental health. And it's essential that we take care of our inner world. And we're saying, if you do not look, you will not see. So if you notice someone seems off, then we want you to go beneath that iceberg, connect with them, and make it your business to connect with empathy, okay? And check in with a professional sooner than later. Don't wait till the very end. You can come, but encourage people to check in sooner than later. Go on to learn more about mental health. And lastly, don't go at it alone, especially if there is crises or really any kind of emotional pain, right? We're social creatures. We're meant to connect together. And I've added an extra step, which is to advocate for parity when it comes to mental health in your organization or in your community, and be curious about how can you have more confidential and discreet resources for people around you to get help, to know where to get help, and to have more psychological safety in the workplace, to say we can talk about how we're really doing, right? Especially during these 2 years. So that's what I leave you with when it comes to stigma. We're on all these different social media platforms. You can find us. And that's all I have for you today when it comes to ending stigma on World Mental Health Day. Okay. So you're free to go. I hope that this was worthwhile for all of you. I'm going to stick around for about 10 minutes and take any anonymous Q&As. We will share a recording of today's session with you. Okay. Take a look at these questions. So we have a comment. I think that the society we live in and work in is very challenging to keep strong mental health. We live in a society where it's never enough. At the same time, in this country, it's expensive to see a psychologist, and most of the insurance doesn't cover the fees, if not for a severe reason. I really appreciate this kind of webinar because it's true, there's a big stigma in mental health, but I also think we should find a way to allow everyone to have support, not only those who can afford it. Thank you. Cost is a huge barrier in this country, right? And so even advocating for insurance to cover for not just severe psychiatric illness, but mental health concerns, I think is important. We at the Lighthouse have more than 12 different free of charge support groups that you can avail as well. And of course, if you cannot afford counseling, it can also be helpful to check in with a GP and say, let's just do some routine blood work and check in and rule out any underlying medical reason for why someone is struggling. Most clinics will also have a sliding scale if there's financial struggle as well. So I would reach out, and almost any clinic will do this, right? But it's usually a case by case at the Lighthouse. Another question is, how do you ask for time off if you are struggling? I have told my boss that I have depression and I am on medication and seeking help. However, there are days when I have episodes and I am afraid to ask for time off. Please provide any tips. So that's a really good question. So how would I talk to my, what I would say is come up with a plan with your counselor on what your needs are, right? So how often does that happen? I would say, are you doing everything when it comes to that emotional hygiene to manage and care for you? And if you're like, yep, I'm doing everything, then I would speak to your manager and let them know what may work for you. You may say, because of this condition that I have or I'm healing through, sometimes I may not be able to come in, and talk to your boss and say, what is the best way for us to manage this if I have a day like that? And come up with a solution together and be curious. It really depends on the nature of your work as well. I think honesty is really important. Now, when you have a leader or a boss that may retaliate or judge or shame, it's not going to be safe to have this conversation, right? And that's when you see a lack of psychological safety where people may be shutting down or being afraid. So I would be cautious to have that conversation if there's no safety. But if there is safety, honesty, curiosity, and come up with a plan together. How can we help a family member if they don't want to seek help? So we can never convince people. So even if you take like the first aid course, one of our guiding principles is your role is never to convince someone to seek help, but you want to give them the right information so that they can make that decision for themselves. The only time you'd want to persist is if they're in crisis. But if you notice someone's against seeking help, I would ask open-ended questions like, tell me more about why you are opposed to seeking help. What can I do to support you? Can I send you some resources? So we would still, best practice tool is to respond with empathy and curiosity and normalize help seeking, right? So when they see you and they're like, oh, well, Farah doesn't seem scared by the idea of me seeing a counselor, people are more likely to be open to that. And if they're closed off, that's okay. We respect it. We'll say, okay, if at any point, you would like to talk about this or I can support you further, please reach out. We will not share a copy of the presentation, but I will prepare a handout for all of you with some key takeaways. Someone said, I understand there's a wait list for the Lighthouse. It's about 6 weeks. I'm sorry, there's a wait list. We're really hiring. We're hiring if anyone knows someone who's looking for a therapy job in Dubai. In the meantime, what can you do to take care of yourself? I would say when you looked at that emotional hygiene list, I would really get good at that. So not doing further harm, that essential self-care, and that building that EQ is what I would do in the meantime, because your counselor is going to be also kind of listening and building that with you. Lots of thank yous. Thank you. That makes me feel good. Um, I'm glad that it was meaningful for many of you. Okay, so we have a question. How do I convince parents who are not accepting their daughter's mental health, that she needs to see someone? They even think of sending her to study where family is available, and she wants to do medical school. She does not want to be married and have kids to feel fulfilled as a woman, which is what her mom keeps saying. That's really tough. And you know, it's interesting because culturally, coming from a Pakistani American family, you'd often hear my mom was, yeah, oh yeah, when you just need to get married. I'm like, what? That is not going to fix or solve anything. And I would say that even in the situation, which would be really frustrating, right? Especially if on that week you're exhausted, is to respond with empathy, right? And you would really want to give them as much information and saying, marriage or going away to school are huge life stressors that can actually make our emotional health worse, right? So we just want to remain consistent, normalize, give them that information, and try to respond with empathy. But that's a tough situation to observe. There can be a lot of helplessness because you almost know that the parent is doing unintentional harm. They think they're doing well, right? All right, everyone. I didn't get to everyone's questions, but you can send me an email if I wasn't able to answer your question. It's, I don't think there's a chat. It's F Dahabi, so it's my last name, FDAHABI at LightHouse Arabia. Thank you for taking the time today to learn about how you can end stigma. It is a topic that everyone at the Lighthouse, it's really our life's calling. So I hope that you integrate some of these action steps. Happy World Mental Health Day, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day. Bye. Take care.